Thank you. Give it up one more time for Ilja Laurs.
Okay, so it's great to see you all here. And first, I was at Slush event 3 years ago. It was much smaller. And I assume this is because the startup movement and startup ideas are getting wider. And what I'm particularly happy about is that the Baltics region is becoming a big place for startups. We really are starting to compete effectively with the Silicon Valley startups, with Israel, and all the other famous places. And apparently, you can see a lot of very successful companies coming out of this region. So what I really wanted to talk about today is what's best to leverage in specifically our region. And if you're big enough, if you have enough ambitions, how can you possibly leverage the famous Silicon Valley to help you achieve some of your really big international global ambitions? So the presentation is called Baltics to Silicon Valley. What I wanted to start is with something I call the modern startup philosophy. Because unlike Silicon Valley, I think there is a slight still misunderstanding here in the region on what startups are about. What are the fundamentals of a startup? So I just wanted to make sure that I cover the basics, just to make sure that we're speaking the same language. So I put the 3 groups of key philosophical points that I think are relevant to the phenomena called the Silicon Valley startup, Silicon Valley style startup. It's pretty much different from the way, say, our fathers or grandfathers used to do business. And the first thing is the goals. When I talk to some of the, I have this habit of talking at different universities, just spreading the word of startups and sharing some of the experience I got. And the one thing that I very often come across is that the whole goal behind startup is a little bit less understood. So if you ask somebody who is not familiar with Silicon Valley type startups, like, what are you building the startup for? What are you trying to achieve? Apparently, there is a class of all these non-financially related issues, like, I want to change the world. I just like this kind of business, so it's personally rewarding for me to be in that area. Yes, there is a class of non-financial goals. But startup typically is about bringing the profitability and ROI to you, the founders, and to your investors, and to your management team. So what I would focus here at this presentation is financial ROI, assuming this is one of the key primary goals behind building a startup. And when you continue, like, okay, you're building a startup to achieve financial independence, to achieve financial reward for what you're doing by taking the risk, how do you profit from the whole operation? And the most frequent answer that I get is, well, that's very simple. And a business is around getting revenue, getting a profit, turning profit into dividends, paying taxes on that, and keeping the rest. And funny thing, 90% of the, say, young businessmen that I talk to assume this is the path. Now, reality is that's the way business was conducted 100 years ago, in the age of Adams and Keynes. And to the highly dynamic, highly modern economics, especially in the IT startup area, this is an old-fashioned, extremely inefficient way to get the financial reward on your investment. So the first point is startups is about building value, company value, as opposed to building a revenue and profit stream and taking out dividends. So forget about dividends. I will try to explain a little bit more, but for now, you can take it that building value for you personally is at least 10 times more profitable than trying to build revenue profit stream and take dividends out. So a Silicon Valley style startup will always be focused on building a company value. Now, how do you make money out of the value? There are 3 ways. Apparently, most of you are dreaming of building a big enough company to take it public. And this is where you get the liquidity event on your equity. And therefore, you can call the broker and say, hey, Peter, Joe, whoever, like, can you sell 0.1% of my shares for a couple of million because I need a new house or something like that? So your equity becomes liquid. when you file an IPO and become a public company. The good thing, it's a very powerful way to essentially get ROI on your investment. The bad thing is, for every one IPO, there is much more other liquidity events. So it's a really rare thing, because you have to be of a certain size, of a certain profile. You have to be big, in other words, to really get liquidity through that way. Still, it's one of the, say, bigger ways. M&A, which is merger and acquisition, is a much faster, much more likely way for you to get financial ROI on your streams. Again, just to get you an idea how much profitable it is to realize say your financial ROI through building value, is if you look at the recent acquisitions in Silicon Valley, it's easy to see that the average price that the acquirers would pay is 10x the revenue. Not the profit, not the EBITDA, which is typical for old-fashioned businesses, the revenue. So that means that if you're building a startup that gets, say, a 1 million revenue a year and generates, say, suppose 100,000 of profit, again, if you move yourself to the dividends path, then essentially you could take say half, because every half you pay taxes, so that 100 profit, you end up with, say, 50,000 personal cash a year if you really try to realize the value through profits and dividends. And if you sell the whole company for 10x the revenue, which would be 10 million, then assuming that the tax for the capital gain is much less, at least in most parts of the world, you typically can keep most part of the 10 million. So you end up having 6-7 million cash compared to 50,000 cash annually, and you can quickly see that it's a much faster, much more profitable way for you to get value, to get profits out of the whole operation. So M&A is very frequent. I think that startups typically underestimate how much liquidity there is in the acquisitions market, and how frequently and often big companies are simply acquiring small companies, even if it's like 5 guys, for them to either achieve a strategic asset or a patent, or just the skill set in that company. I've heard stories that big companies consider acquisitions as an easy way to hire, because it's simple. You get like 20, 50 guys like in one transaction, as opposed to hiring them a year long. So when a big company is looking for an expertise in a specific area, it's much simpler just to look around to see what kind of startups exist, who are the best. And sometimes, again, forget the product, forget the revenue, forget the market cap. Sometimes they just buy people because it's easy. And again, interestingly, I heard this Silicon Valley idea that the current rate is like $1 million a person. So if you're a team of 10 guys, you can count if you're skilled enough to get 10 million just because you exist in one place. So again, a second point is that there is a lot of liquidity in the M&A market, and that actually is the most frequent way for you to realize value of the whole operation. Again, as a starting point, you can count on 10x revenue. Again, assuming with certain growth and certain profile, but that's been the recent multiple on transactions. And in fact, most recently, it became even more crazy. And some acquisitions like Google buying AdMob ended up like crazy, like 20+ times annual revenue. A little understood way of getting, but becoming nevertheless the very modern and very popular way of again, personal founders reward on your operation is secondary transactions. The dilemma for a founder very frequently is that, yes, I realize that IPO M&A are like the ultimate monetization and liquidity events. So this is where I get paid for all my effort. But what I do on the way, it's like 5 years away from now. I want my money now because I have a wife and she has certain habits and whatever. Most recently, if you look at companies like Zynga and Facebook and Groupon and similars, including ours, there has to be, say, a way to get your financial ROI slightly earlier when you have a main liquidity event. That's called the secondary transactions. So that means when you're doing your funding round, like Series A, B, C, I'm pretty sure, I assume you're familiar what is a funding round. Essentially, this is where you get new investor in or old investor putting more money. and to accelerate your business to grow it forward, assuming there is certain success for your business already at this time. So typically, if your company is doing great, if you're raising another fund, typically investors actually are okay with letting you keep part of the money that they invest right into your pocket as opposed to your company. And this is called a secondary transaction. So it means, like, if you're raising like 10 million, it would be, say, appropriate to ask for 1 or 2 million, just like in your pocket, because A, this provides you early liquidity than you otherwise would. B, actually, interestingly as it would sound, it does align you more with the investors. Because investors, unlike you, have a very different risk profile. They want to invest money. They want to burn the money fast to learn whether there's something about the money. They're OK if you completely lose the money, because they, again, coming back from the formula that I told earlier, for every 10 attempts, you have one massive success. So they're looking for that one champion investment. So nothing happens to them if 9 companies simply go out of business completely. And they diversify the risk across the entire portfolio, because they have hundreds of companies in the portfolio. But for you, it's a totally different risk profile. You don't want to be the one who is the other 9 that failed, because you end up with nothing on the street. And typically, the dynamics it creates is that founders typically would be pushing for less risk, slower growth, less reward business, so less profitable but less risky as well, because you don't want to create too much risk profile on yourself. But the investors would typically push you for the opposite. They want high risk, high speed, high reward. So what happens in the secondary market, that regulates the whole thing. Because once you as a founder get a couple million out, you no longer care about some small exit or small outcome, because you're financially set. And then the next thing you want to do is really create something big. So it makes your risk profile more compatible, more risky, high speed, high reward. So it's a common practice, very, very common. And it's a way for you to essentially get liquidity on the way. It's also a tool, a powerful tool, to align your founder's interest with the interest of the investors. Again, I spent a little bit more time on that particular one because I felt it's not widely known. So the second point is the execution. There are 3 things that I kind of separated in the Silicon Valley style startup that I'm observing are slightly different from what I observe here in the Baltics or the Eastern region. And one of them is super focus. Means do one thing only, but do it best. The comparison and the metaphor that I use here is it's like, consider business like sports, right? And if you want to be an Olympic champion, you have to dedicate your life to running or whatever the choice of the sport. But typically, you won't be able to physically do more than one sport, because it takes your entire life. And you have to run slightly, like 1 tiny second better than somebody else. But that 1 tiny second faster means you get the Olympic medal and the second doesn't. So typically, if you look at the Silicon Valley type startup, they won't be doing like everything. Consultancy, a little project, another project, something else. They would be highly super focused on one thing. And that's very different from what I see in, say, in our part of the world, where a typical startup, primarily in the lack of funding or, as a way to distribute the risks, is doing a little bit of consultancy. So he would have like a couple of corporate clients that he's developing databases, e-commerce solutions for. Then, they're doing like 5 products. One of them is, gaming, or something else is database, and so on and so on. But again, when you do 5 things, means each one of those 5 gets 1/5 of your resources, attention, and therefore you risk that somebody else who's would do better than you, that tiny fraction of a second better, but he will get the gold medal, and nobody will know your name. And the second reason is, again, given that looking at the ways how you withdraw value from your operation, and the probability is highest that you will do M&A, if you put yourself in the acquirer's chair, you will realize if somebody buys you, they buy for something specific, right? So suppose you develop like 2 big, great products. odds are that if Google or Microsoft or Facebook or somebody else is looking at you, odds are that they want one of the product, because that's what they are acquiring you for, because they realize you have some assets that they need. Now, if you have two, the odds are that the second product they just don't need at all. So what it makes they evaluate you half of what you think you're worth, because essentially we need only half of your company, but it's bundled with the second half, so you don't realize the value. Do one thing, do it best, make sure that nobody else is as good as you. Super focus on that. The second thing is do super fast. If you ask me what a key advantage a startup has for big companies and Microsoft and Nokia of the world, I would say is the speed. Because big companies like elephants or like trains never move fast. To change, I was talking to one big web company exec and said, look, I noticed a small mistake on your web page. And he said, the funny thing, Ilya, it will take me a year to correct that one little letter, because it has to go to the product planning phase, then it goes to assigning, product development cycles, product delivery, testing, blah, blah, blah. Like end of the year, that letter will be corrected. So one word, full year. And we're living in an extremely high speed environment where everything changes daily. And the advantage, massive advantage you have is if you decide I want to do that, you could have something done in 2 weeks, literally. If you lock yourself in the room and start coding, and your specialist is like free of you, in 2 weeks you can have, say, a prototype of Facebook, if you will. And there is no way in 2 weeks in a big company like Google, even a planning meeting will not happen. So act super fast. And the second reason, apparently, if you don't run fast, somebody else will. So if you come across a niche that is massive, big, profitable, promising, there is no way nobody else will see that niche. Big ideas like big elephants, they're always visible. Again, if you look at the biggest ideas that have been realized in the last 5 years, like the Facebook, Groupon, and the likes, social games, you will realize they didn't start from scratch. The ideas that, yes, something might be big in social area was around since MySpace, since Friendster, since Classmates. So it seems that, it's like, planet consolidation. There's like, we focus, getting denser and denser and denser around certain ideas. Like, yes, social is becoming big and big and big and big, so the solution becomes thicker, thicker, thicker. There's like, a dozen of companies working there, and then, bam, you have one winner. And that seems to be the case in every single case. Google search. We've seen Aaltoes, Yahoo, again, the space was consolidating, you have one winner. So big ideas, just like elephants, everybody sees them. If you want to execute well, you have to super focus and be faster than anybody else. And apparently, a priori, you have to be the best. So IT and startup business is much about the winner. It's like American election, winner takes all model. So again, coming back to the comparison to sports, if you're running and 100 guys are running the marathon as well, and you run like a tiny fraction of a second faster than the second one, you get the gold medal. So the winner takes it all. Very rarely you see like the third or fifth or et cetera guys. Ask yourself, who's the second biggest social network? Assuming Twitter actually is not social network. Nobody knows. Who's the second biggest search engine or the third biggest search engine? Well, rarely we mention Bing. Beyond that, Yahoo. Beyond that, nobody knows. And so on and so on. So typically, you have to realize there's probably 100 of guys running in the same direction as you. And you either are the best, or you're simply lost in the crowd. The resources. Again, this is one of the, this is probably not a big issue for Silicon Valley kids. I was talking to one 10 years old. He explained me everything about angel funding, Series A, B, C, IPO, valuations, and all this stuff, which I was highly surprised. But my experience in our part of the world, say this VC and risk capital funding model is not known at all in most cases. I mean, to this crowd, I'm sure it is. But if I talk to like a random sample of students in universities and just ask like simple question, you got this idea, how are you going to fund it? Like most often, the answer I get is, Well, it's simple. I go to a bank, mortgage my house or flat, and get a credit and implement that. But I don't do that because I don't have an apartment or house to mortgage. So I don't even start. And again, the famous story how Rich Wong, I don't know if he's here, called me first time, like first time in the office and introduced himself and told he's a VC. I have spent 6 years studying economics and banking. My question to him, what is a VC? Like, what guys do you do? So this is totally wrong because it's a very modern tool. It essentially allows a student with an idea and no apartment to mortgage against realize that idea. So angel or VC money is what propels the whole thing. It allows you to have resources that in turn allow you to focus. You don't have to do that little consultancy project to focus on the main thing. It also allows you to be super fast. That means get the necessary resources to hire the team that you want to hire like now as opposed to a year later and do the things now. Also hire the best people to make sure that you have a best chance of developing the best product. And use the money to, again, get the best resources that you can possibly get. So again, these are the ideas behind the Silicon Valley type startup. So what's great in the Baltics? Everybody knows the Silicon Valley, and everybody is afraid sometimes to compete with those guys. But reality is there are a lot of advantages that you can take of that specific WIS region to have a head start against your Silicon Valley peers. Education, technically savvy, and hungry. Well, I'm not sure about Finland. It might be a separate case, but if you take a look at the Eastern Europe, I call it the hackers generation. Our generation has to admit that we earlier on, when we were teenagers, we had access to a lot of educational versions of different kinds of software, let's call it this way. Because the computer piracy has been very high. So the comparison I say is, look at the American teenager and say Eastern European teenager 10 years ago. That one is working in McDonald's right after school, goes back at home. His computer has only 3 games that are all legal. He got it from Christmas from his father. And the first time he has a chance to see 3D Studio Max or Visual SDK that costs $25,000 each package, he has it in university. Now, take a look at the Eastern European peer. You're sitting in your 2x2 room. Right after school, you have half day to last. You are not in baseball team because there is no baseball team in your school. There is nothing to do in the yard. I mean, there are some fun things to do in the yard, but mostly you don't enjoy them. And your little computer packed probably $1 million worth of software, educational purposes, of course, is what you experiment with. And you're already sick of games because you played all of them as soon as they come because you can get $1, for $1 you can get everything what's been produced. What do? You play with 3D Studio Max, you play with Visual SDK, you start coding, you start doing little things because that's fun. And scroll back 10 years later, you get the US teens that are capable of using iPhones, but not Nokias. And you have a hacker generation in Eastern Europe that knows everything about computers. So up front, again, and that's my practical experience as well, is if you generally talk to, say, youngsters, technically they would be much more savvy in our part of the world than it is typically in the United States. Apparently we're hungry. Again, I'm not sure about Finland, but the Eastern European in general, in the last 20 years, say, is coming from a lot of difficult environments, me personally as well, that makes you really want to achieve something. I read an interesting article about Germany, and one of the big problems in Germany is the current generation simply doesn't want to work because all the wealth has been created by the previous generation. So once you have a house, a bank account, a lot of obligations, assets, investments, and so on, why do you need to work at all? You just survive, live. So infrastructure. A lot has been said that the internet and mobile penetration and mobile networks and everything related to the internet is extremely developed in our part of the world. E-governments, banking systems, online systems, everything's internet, everything's voting and all this stuff. Highest internet speeds, best data services, density of fiber optics. Yes, because we're small partially, it's easy for us to be advanced. It's not like America where it takes ages to build infrastructure. So what if you're using all that infrastructure to get free torrents? That's a separate part of the story. But as a result, infrastructure is generally great. And this is advantage primarily over, say, other development areas like India or Asia, because they also have cheap labor. They also have quite savvy people. But unlike us, they don't have any necessary infrastructure. So certainly, we should leverage that. And the environment. Again, compared to our big competitors in Asia, we are part of the European Union. We are close to both Western and Eastern accesses of capital and resources. So we are in a unique position to compete on that infrastructure and legal environment, and our position with other guys like Asian territories and so on. Not speaking that we're actually closer to acquirers and capital and Western Europe and all these centers. So these are the pretty big advantages. Conclusion on the location, I think personally and honestly that when it comes to experimenting, testing ideas, coming with prototypes, and coming with early models, new models, innovative models of success, the Baltic region is actually awesome. And I think having hundreds of startups here is a direct proof of that. But having said that, there are a lot of things we still need to learn. And again, equally valid conclusion would be that as soon as you have an idea or a prototype or a model that is likely to become global, you might consider expanding to Silicon Valley, because there are a lot of unique things there that you simply cannot find in our part of the world. What's most striking is the people. The one thing which makes, say, Silicon Valley so attractive is because this is the area where you find narrow specialists. Again, having said earlier that you have to develop the best product, and it just have to be, competitive and beat up, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. The best product is done by the best people. Best people typically are not the smartest ones, but are those who specialize in some one narrow area. And if you need to scale your database to 300 computers, or you need like an awesome graphical design in a layout of a page, only in Silicon Valley you will have the professionals that have done like that one little specific thing for the entire life. Market is big, demand for professionals is very high, and people who are specializing in one very specific area can survive, can develop their skills. And this is what I observed is not the case in our part of the world. Well, everybody is a generalist. Because reality is if only thing you do is scaling database, you won't find much work in our part of the world. Because there are not many companies that constantly, every single day, need scaling databases. So the observation I have is our area is great for generalists, what I call people with every given skill. If it's a coder, he can do PHP, Java, C++, MySQL, and everything else. But that also means that he will not have ultimate knowledge of every single MySQL operation at every single level and optimize like to the ultimate performance. So when you are at the stage where you need to build like a highly competitive product, you might start realizing you need really highly skilled, highly professional, very narrow specialists. And you may discover that it's only the Silicon Valley where you can get them. Coming back to motivation, because that's what really driving people, I realize that, and I talk that often, that Europe in general is not really the best place for innovation, partially because of the relaxed European environment, I call it, meaning that work itself is not at the highest set of values for an average European. Like we talk about social security, safety, we talk about personal creativity, personal self-realization, the weekends with family, vacations and everything else. So in general, and I'm pretty sure this is not the case with this crowd, but in general, Europeans don't have work itself as one of their biggest values. As a result, say the effort that general average European is putting into his work is not as high as a general typical American does. Because unlike Europe, America work itself is one of the highest values. You feel personally rewarded for being a workaholic. It's a cursing word in Europe, but it's like an awesome word in the United States. Everybody says, hey, I've done like 100 hours a week. And it's like, feel proud of that. And for a startup, apparently the motivation is very important. So the motivation scheme for options, which is very poorly understood in Europe, is the highest motivation for the startup. So typically, my experience getting people to work in Silicon Valley, you get much higher ROI on them than you typically get by hiring people in Europe. And again, Facebooks have not been done by working 9 to 6. It's nonsense. You have to work much harder than that. And people in, say, Silicon Valley, in my experience, realize that and are willing to do that. And apparently, you compensate them for that. And apparently, the skill set. There are some areas where I feel, at least Eastern Europe, doesn't even have a right school of thought. Primarily sales, marketing. I'm coming from Lithuania. The modern business and market economy exists in Lithuania for the last 20 years. Assuming that if you want to get a super professional marketer, he has to come with 20 years of marketing experience on the field. By definition, there has not been enough time in our part of the world for the necessary skill set to just consolidate and become available to any people. So my experience, in some areas, sales, marketing, public relationship, and many others, you discover that you simply don't have people at all, regardless of how hard you try. So again, coming back to this formula that you have to be the best, meaning that not only your engineering and product has to be best, means everything has to be best, including marketing and sales, PR and everything else. The only way to get that kind of people is to look for them outside our region. And apparently the environment. Everything from funding to acquisition market to IT infrastructure with state-of-the-art data centers and so on. You may discover for the general supporting environment is much more powerful in Silicon Valley. And again, the comparison I use here is the fertility of the soil, right? So I would put, say, some parts of the world as desert, sand, nothing can grow there. I would put Baltic region, say, somewhat fertile. I would put Silicon Valley is the most fertile environment because access to capital is way easier. On my personal experience, the valuations you get are twice as high. I'm not kidding. I've done 3 rounds. On my second round, I was able to compare a few term sheets from both Europe and the United States. On average, the valuation of a European VC firm would be half of what I've seen in the United States. Why? Because there are a few European VCs only. They still model the startup business using Keynes and Adams valuations, EBITDAs, and all this stuff, which is bullshit and nonsense for startups. And there are only few of them. That means there is no competition. Sand Hill Road is hundreds and hundreds of investors who compete with each other to get fund the next big guy. Acquirers, again, assuming that the highest multiples are paid by guys like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Yahoo, and all those guys. To them, you always have to realize that acquiring your existing team and market share, product, and know-how is only half of your work. Another half is integrating you well into the existing infrastructure and realizing that most of that infrastructure actually is there. You immediately see that if everything is being equal, like there is a 10 guys, same market share, same products, and everything team is in Silicon Valley, and the same team is in our part of the world, 99% chance Microsoft or Google will choose the local team because they simply pull the people and integrate. They have the same mentality, same motivation. They know how to work with them, same legal environment, and so on. So that's painless. And what would be wrong to assume, what many startups assume, hey, but we got like slightly cheaper labor costs. Forget that. Labor costs are totally irrelevant for startups. And that's why one of my favorite jokes is saying, look, while everybody is outsourcing to Eastern Europe for coding, I do totally the opposite. So I really want to hire coders and programmers whom I pay 2-3 times the salary I used to pay in Lithuania because of one simple thing. The cost of the labor is totally irrelevant to a startup, totally. Because if you win, if you are the best, the value created is so much higher than any labor cost, it simply sinks in that value. Now, if you lose, you saved your investors a few million, but personally, you get nothing of that at all. So when you're a startup, what is important is run faster, get the best people, the best product, be the winner. Conclusion is, again, if in 3 words, A, do understand the basics and the philosophy behind the startup to formulate the right goals. Do chase the right objectives. Second is Baltics, I think, is awesome space to do a lot of experimentation and prototypes and ideas. I see the innovation and the diversity of ideas much higher than I see in Silicon Valley, especially in mobile space, where mobile started only with the iPhone a few years ago, while it existed 10 years already plus in our part of the world. And the third is when you feel you're at the edge of breaking through and making something global and big, do evaluate the Silicon Valley possibilities to maybe give you that additional last resource to go global. So that's pretty much it. I wanted to have 10 minutes for questions. Thank you for your attention. And if anybody has questions, I'm totally happy to answer them. Oh, thank you. So any questions at all? Sure.
Tomi Pajarinen, thank you for your presentation and coming to Helsinki. Angel lists something like 8,000 startups. How do you see that environment from a competitive point of view? How can you actually be a successful company among these 8,000 vis-a-vis the investors?
I'll take an example and sample of a mobile business, right? I mean, on the one hand, 1,000 startups looks like a lot, right? Assuming there's average maybe 2-3 people per startup, you get like 3,000 people trying something, right? It sounds like a lot. Now, when you consider the opportunities for your startups, I think mobile space is familiar to me. We are researchers, 4 independent big researchers, Forrester, Juniper, the likes, suggesting the value of mobile applications market is going to be $30 to $50 billion annually in just 3 years from now, right? Just for comparison, that's twice as much as the entire music industry, including Lady Gaga's, Rihanna's, Virgin, and everything else. Now, typically what I do is I divide the future value of the market by number of people it can employ. I end up personally in mobile with 1 million professionals employed with high salaries. Now then, assuming that this is a, say, $40 billion market, capable of employing 1 million people, and there is only 3,000 people chasing that opportunity, you come up with a really interesting conclusion that even though 3,000 is a lot, each of them actually has statistically an opportunity of hiring 30 people. 30 people is a 30 million company on average, so there is a decent chance for everybody. So I don't think that 1,000 startups is, say, a big number at all. And that's only mobile area. There are massively more areas. Anybody else? Sure.
Hi, Ilja, and thanks for coming here. I'm Pekka Vartiainen. I just wonder, could you tell us who do you think are the biggest competitors to GetJar?
Sure. Well, there are a number of them. Currently, we identified Android apparently as the platform of choice for everybody for the next few years. So on that platform, as you might know, we are competing with Google head-to-head with Android market. Plus, the competition I would call is slightly unfair and difficult for non-Google players because Google is putting a lot of restrictions on the way of everybody non-Google. Nevertheless, I always believed that coming with a better product for a user is the key to winning. So if you compare our services, specifically on Android, if you come to our site, you will find today hundreds of best-selling paid Android applications and games for free. So on a single visit, you can save $100 because you will get all the best-selling games for free because we have a much more powerful business model where Groupons and Zyngas spending their marketing money pay for your party. So as a consumer, what would you choose? Going to market and paying $3, $4, $5, $10 per game, or going to us, a little bit of extra mile, because you have to type m.getjar.com on your mobile phone, as opposed to click the market icon, so a little bit of extra effort what we ask, but it saves you hundreds of dollars on your lifetime, because you don't pay a dime. Plus, I mean, I don't know if you have kids, but giving our market to kids is safe. They cannot spend money on it. It's all free. So assuming this is a better product, we feel it's enough for us to compete even with the likes of Google. That's always what I believed into. Any other questions? Still have like 5 minutes. Sure, in the back.
Hi, and thanks for the presentation. As part of my final MBA on the finance track, I was interviewing European venture capitalists. And one thing that came up very frequently on the issue of valuation is the non-existing or very hard exit market. How do you see it yourself coming from Europe? Is it really that bad that big companies don't buy small startups in Europe, or is it just that we have to go on the other side of the Atlantic? Thank you.
Sure. Well, if you notice in my last slide, I put this general environment for a startup as Silicon Valley being better. So part of that was that the liquidity on companies is much higher in Silicon Valley. The tradition of integrating and buying companies in Silicon Valley is much greater than here in Europe, where the companies such as Nokia are built slightly different way. And if you look at the experience of acquisitions in Europe, you will observe that there's a lot of failures at integrating the external companies into the big ones. So Nokia has had a few cases like that. So in general, I would agree that specifically M&A opportunities in Europe are less than the United States. From VC perspective, a pretty important thing is that the multiples that European acquirers are paying generally are much, much less than Americans one. So when I was talking about 10x revenue, that's a typical for Silicon Valley. If you start talking to somebody in Europe, it would be more looking like a 5x EBITDA. So from VC perspective, means the ROI on your investment is less. But the one thing, and at least the belief that I have, is that today's world is so small and so connected that if you win, then you win globally, just like Skype or Angry Birds. It's a European product, but if you really do best work, you win totally globally. And then if you are a global winner, then acquirers are accessible to you both sides of the pond easily. Again, Skype sold for Microsoft $8.5 billion is a perfect example. So the only solution to that is say, don't look at the exit opportunities in European context. If you really believe that your product and service is best, it's certainly legitimate to expect to win globally. And if you win globally, then again, all the exit opportunities that exist, going public on NASDAQ, or getting sold to Microsoft or Google on Yahoo, or again, getting your secondary liquidity from US investors who pay on a high multiple and so on, become available to you. So the only solution is, I would recommend, both for VCs and for startups, is for startups to build a global startup, and for VC to invest something which has a chance to become global. Well, I guess I'm a little bit out of time, so appreciate your attention, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.